The man known to history as Vito Genovese was born on the 21st of November 1897 in the town of Risigliano, less than 20 kilometers from the city of Naples in southern Italy. His father was Frances Felice, or Philippe Genovese, a poor laborer who worked on various sites around Naples during Vito's youth, notably as a construction worker. Vito's mother was Nunziata. She and Felice had 4 children in all, a daughter whose name is not known, and 2 other boys by the names of Michael and Carmine. Vito Genovese's story epitomizes how a small number of young men who were born in Italy in the late 19th century shaped the Italian mafia, or Cosa Nostra, our thing, in the United States for much of the 20th. By the time Genovese was born in 1897, the exodus of people from the Italian peninsula, a phenomenon which characterized the country's history for well over half a century in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was already well underway. This was part of a larger immigration, which saw tens of millions of Europeans leave the Old World and migrate to the Americas from the 1830s onwards, as industrialization and booming population growth put huge pressure on resources in Europe. Italy experienced tremendous levels of emigration after the unification of the country in the early 1860s. Between the start of official records in 1876 and 1900, nearly 5 million Italians left the peninsula, with another 8 million or more leaving between 1900 and 1914. Of these, at least 9 million never returned home, the majority of whom formed the bedrock of Argentinian society and the Italian-American community of the United States. Between 1880 and 1920, 4 million Italians made the United States their home, settling in large numbers in New York City, Chicago, Providence, Pittsburgh, and other cities. Opportunities for quick riches were hard to come by in a country which was profoundly xenophobic towards the Irish and Italians during these decades. This xenophobia was driven in part by the arrival of large numbers of immigrants, and more especially by fears of many immigrants' adherence to Roman Catholicism. Some immigrants turned to crime to further themselves, often drawing on a tradition in southern Italy and Sicily where mafia-like organizations had emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Genovese family was soon amongst those who joined the exodus from Italy to the New World, but that did not occur until 1913, when Vito was 15 years of age. Very little is known about his early life and the family life of the Genoveses in southern Italy before they left for America. It is clear that Vito had long left school before his immigration, having received only a basic primary education up to the late 1900s, and then having left school when he was 10 or 11 to start earning money for the family. By 1913, the Genoveses, like so many other Italians, decided that their future lay elsewhere. The Genoveses did not leave Italy all at once. In a common pattern for Italian migrants, Vito headed across the Atlantic first in 1913 on board the SS Taorina. US federal immigration records indicate that his mother did not join him there until 1920. It is unclear when his father arrived, or if Michael and Carmine traveled with Vito in 1913. There are virtually no records of his sister, other than some brief mentions of her made by Vito over the years, and she possibly died during infancy or childhood. The family had a cousin in Queens in New York City, and it seems possible that Vito stayed initially with her upon his arrival in 1913. It wasn't long before Vito had his first scrape with the law in America. In April 1917, when he was 19 years old, he was arrested for illegal possession of a firearm in Manhattan. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty, which he did, and he was sentenced to 60 days in prison. But with the First World War raging in Europe and the US having just entered the conflict in response to German attacks on American ships in the Atlantic, Genovese was granted the option of joining the military instead. He agreed to do so and was sent to Long Island in 1918 for training. But he never saw service, the war ending in Europe before he was ever shipped off to the front lines. This experience, however, did little to deter Genovese. The details of his criminal activities in the late 1910s and early 1920s are very hazy, and given the criminal nature of them, they are necessarily secretive. It has been suggested that he was involved in running a prostitution ring on the Lower East Side during this period, but this remains unproven. What seems evident, though, is that Genovese was working his way into Italian-American organized crime networks in New York during these years. For in 1924, he clearly emerges as a prominent bootlegger benefiting from Prohibition. It is hard to understate exactly how important Prohibition was in the emergence of the Italian-American mafia in the interwar period and the rise of figures like Vito Genovese. There had been calls for decades for restrictions to be placed on alcohol consumption in the United States, and this was part of a wider process in Protestant countries like Canada, Norway and Finland, which all banned the sale and supply of alcohol in the early 20th century, owing to concerns about public drunkenness and domestic abuse driven by intoxication. In America, Prohibition, which began in January 1920, 1 year after the passage of the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution and the attendant Volstead Act, may have also had a racial undertone, as the ban was driven by American Protestants of British descent, who viewed excessive alcohol consumption as being synonymous with the influx of Italians, Irish and Germans into the country since the middle of the 19th century. These same legislators often continued to drink through the 1920s, but viewed Prohibition as a perfect opportunity to close down Italian restaurants and Irish and German bars. It didn't have the desired effect, instead driving the trade underground, into speakeasies fueled by alcohol supplied by bootleggers, many of whom were Italian or Irish. The illicit trade created huge opportunities to make money for rising criminals like Vito Genovese in the 1920s, and in doing so, Prohibition transformed the Italian-American crime world from a disorganized collection of gangs into a well-run national syndicate. While there is no doubt that Genovese was already involved for some time amongst the Italian-American bootleggers who ran much of the illegal booze trade in the tri-state area in the 1920s, he bursts onto the official record literally with a bang in the early summer of 1924. In mid-May, he was involved in a very serious car crash near Prospect Park when driving back to New York City from Coney Island. One of his co-passengers in the car died, and Genovese was left with a dislocated shoulder and 3 broken ribs. He explained it away to the New York Police Department as a bad car accident, but weapons were found near the scene and the police were convinced that Genovese and his associates in the car had actually been attacked by a group of rival bootleggers who had plowed into the car at speed. It was the first of many police reports filed on Vito from 1924 onwards, some involving him in suspected murder cases, others for gun possession, and on one occasion in July 1926, when he himself was shot in the neck and barely survived. What the NYPD had not yet pieced together was that Genovese, along with numerous other Italian-born criminals, including Charles Lucky Luciano and Francesco Castiglia, better known as Frank Costello, who were all in their 20s or early 30s at the time, were working as part of the bootlegging operations of Joe the Boss Masseria, one of the most powerful Italian-American mafia bosses in New York City in the 1920s. Genovese, Luciano and Costello rose to positions of immense power as a result of Prohibition and the opportunities it afforded them. Indeed, by the late 1920s, Genovese was already a wealthy man. This wasn't just from bootlegging. He was also prominent in a scheme to counterfeit gold certificates based on the dollar at a time when the US was still using the gold standard, where the dollar was tied to gold reserves. This, rather than their bootlegging operations, was what concerned many federal authorities in Washington, D.C. about the Italian mafia. Genovese was nearly indicted for his activity in 1930. However, the case was dismissed for a lack of concrete evidence. Jail wasn't the only risk he faced, as the car incident in 1924 and the bullet wound he suffered in the neck in 1926 indicated. The 1920s were also a bloody time in the history of the mafia. Genovese and his associates were active in shooting rivals while being shot at. In February 1930, for instance, around the time that the federal police were trying to indict him on counterfeiting charges, Genovese was involved in the murder of Gaetano Reina, an associate who had recently abandoned Masseria and gone to work for Salvatore Maranzano, the head of the Castellamare crime family, which had been expanding its operations out of its base in Brooklyn. Reina was shot from close range with a double-barrel shotgun after leaving his mistress's apartment in the Bronx. It was widely believed that Genovese was one of the two men who ambushed and killed him. The murder of Reina led to an all-out turf war between Masseria and his crew, which included Genovese, Luciano and Costello, with Maranzano and his associates, one which would drag on for over a year between Reina's murder in February 1930 through to April 1931. It is known as the Castellamarese War, after the town of Castellamarese del Golfo, a port town in Sicily where Maranzano and several of his crew members hailed from originally. The war resulted in a series of tit-for-tat murders, with hostilities extending beyond New York and the tri-state area to other cities like Chicago, where the respective families involved had ties to other crews or crime families. By the end of 1930, the tide had turned against Masseria. Seeing the writing on the wall, Genovese and Luciano made contact with Maranzano and agreed to turn on Masseria if Maranzano then ended the war and shared power in New York with them. He agreed, and on the 15th of April 1931, at the Nuova Villa Tamaro, a Coney Island restaurant, Luciano, Genovese and a number of their associates, including Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, gunned down Masseria. Genovese led the handful of individuals inside who killed their former employer. The event partially inspired the murder scene in the first Godfather film, as Luciano excused himself to go to the toilet before Genovese, Siegel and the others burst in to open fire on Masseria's table. With his death, the Castellamarese War came to an end. Masseria's murder simply brought one period of conflict to an end and created a new problem. With the Castellamarese War over, Maranzano called a meeting of many of the bosses of the New York crime outfits at Wappingers Falls in New York State. There he informed them that the Italian-American mafia in New York and surrounding areas was to be run henceforth by the five families or outfits, who would be headed by himself, Luciano, Giuseppe Profaci, Thomas Galliano and Vincent Mangano. This concept of the five families is a concept which has endured long after the Prohibition era. While the names of the five families have changed over time as new leaders have come and gone, the concept that there would be five Italian-American outfits running affairs and that parts of New York's crime world would be divided up between them has lived on for nearly a century. However, Maranzano's other dispensation was much less popular. He also informed those gathered at Wappingers Falls that he was now the capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses, and that each family would pay tribute to him accordingly. This met with immediate resentment, which Maranzano was now more aware of. Consequently, when he ordered Luciano, Genovese and Costello to meet him at his office on Park Avenue in Manhattan in early September 1931, they became suspicious that he intended to have them killed. Instead, they struck first, securing aid from Meyer Lansky, the famous mob's accountant and a long-standing ally of Luciano's, to hire several hitmen who stabbed and shot Maranzano to death. With the end of the war, the heads of the different groups in New York and wider afield in cities like Chicago, Providence and Buffalo met together at a meeting convened by Luciano in Chicago, with the support of Genovese, Costello and others. There they reformed and expanded the system which Maranzano had tried to create months earlier. Luciano called it the Commission. Expanding on the idea of the five families, it was decided that a commission of 7 bosses, being the heads of the 5 families of New York, the head of the Buffalo branch of the Mafia, and the head of affairs in Chicago, would meet together as a kind of board who would manage the wider affairs of the Italian Mafia. Luciano was offered the position of boss of bosses. He refused it, arguing later that it simply would have created jealousies and made him a target like Maranzano had become. Instead, he would chair commission meetings as a gathering of equals. Genovese was not a member of the commission at this juncture, but after they had killed Masseria earlier that year and Luciano had declared that he was taking over the Masseria business, Luciano had declared Genovese to be the second in command of the Luciano crime family. Costello was an advisor or consigliere at this stage, yet as we will see, the rivalry between Genovese and Costello would come to define much of their later lives. The months after the end of the Castellamarese War and the establishment of the Commission were chaotic ones in Genovese's personal life. Vito had married his first wife, Donata, back in the early 1920s. They had a daughter named Nancy, who was born in 1923, but no further children. Then, on the 17th of September 1931, just a week after he and Luciano had organized the murder of Maranzano, Donata died from tuberculosis. After an elaborate funeral that had reportedly cost Vito $30,000, he quickly set his attentions on Anna Vernotico, a married woman in her mid-20s, whose husband Gerardo was a small-time thief and aspiring bootlegger operating out of Greenwich Village. It is a part of mob law that Genovese had Gerardo garroted to death and his corpse left on a Manhattan rooftop in mid-March 1932, before quickly marrying Anna. However, the evidence is not strong. For starters, Gerardo was found murdered alongside an associate who Genovese had no reason to kill, and Vernotico's death certificate lists him as divorced, suggesting that he and Anna had split legally before he was killed. As such, there was no reason for Genovese to kill him. This aside, Genovese didn't try to disavow the rumor that was spreading, and just a few weeks later he married Anna. It was a shotgun wedding. Anna gave birth to their son Philip at the end of June, and she had evidently been his mistress prior to Donata's death. It was a disparate family they would have in years to come, raising 3 children, one a daughter named Marie from Anna's marriage to Vernotico, the second Vito's daughter Nancy from his first marriage, and the third their own son Philip. To add to the many changes which had occurred in his personal life and within the crime world of New York in the early 1930s, a legal change was about to upend the lives of Genovese and his associates. After a decade in which prohibition had done nothing but fuel criminality across the country in the 1920s, many politicians in Washington, D.C. wanted the ban on the sale and supply of alcohol to be brought to an end. There were also economic motives. Repealing the 18th Amendment would act as a boon to the American economy, in a way which was badly needed in the context of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Thus, prohibition was repealed in December 1933. It had acted as the fuel which turned the Italian-American crime world into the organized mafia, which is well known to all. But now Genovese, Luciano, and their many associates would have to find new avenues of revenue. They did so by cornering the market in illegal narcotics in New York, which was being almost entirely smuggled from China at the time. Though soon the fabled French connection, whereby Italian and French mobsters ran narcotics factories in Marseille in southern France and the island of Corsica before shipping it to America, also began to play a role in the trade. The mobsters also began trying to control the gambling sector, with Genovese's associate Bugsy Siegel leading the mob's search for a site where gambling could thrive. What is seldom noted, though, is that the first place they attempted to do this in the 1930s, as prohibition came to an end, was the free state of Galveston on the coast of Texas, where gambling flourished in the first half of the 20th century. It was only after gambling in Galveston was cracked down on in the 1940s that the mob began focusing their attentions on developing Las Vegas, Nevada, as the haven for their gambling operations. Gambling was central to one of the more important incidents of Genovese's life, when in 1934 he and an associate by the name of Michele Miranda, who had also been born near Naples in the Old Country, came up with a 2-stage scheme to con a prosperous merchant with a gambling problem out of $160,000 through a rigged card game and a somewhat bizarre claim that they had a machine that could produce counterfeit money. The con worked, and the merchant decided to simply eat the loss, obviously too afraid to protest in the face of people who had killed many individuals over the years. However, another associate of Genovese's, Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia, insisted that Genovese owed him $35,000 out of the $160,000 in return for him bringing the details of the mark in the first place. Genovese was evidently not interested in paying, and in September 1934 he had Boccia shot dead in a Brooklyn coffee shop. They also tried to kill William Gallo, an accomplice of Boccia's, who sometimes carried out robberies with him. But the murder of Gallo was botched. He was shot. However, those sent to do it didn't follow Genovese and Miranda's macabre orders that they should douse him in petrol and set him on fire afterwards. As a result, Gallo lived to provide evidence to a New York magistrate on the whole affair, and an investigation into Genovese's role in murdering Boccia was initiated. It would hang like a shadow over him and dictated the course of much of his life over the next decade. The murder of Boccia and the attempted incineration of Gallo point towards Genovese's darker side, a man who would kill with little compunctions and often over relatively trivial matters. Over the course of his lifetime, he was involved in dozens, if not hundreds of murders, some of which were brought about for far less than the $35,000 Boccia was looking for in 1934. He actively cultivated this image of himself as a violent figure, hence his decision to not deny the alleged role in murdering his second wife's former husband. In person, though, he was something of an enigma. Many people recounted in later years that he was a quiet and relatively placid figure, certainly not the caricature of an impulsive psychopath in the vein of Al Capone, and yet he also had an explosive temper, which could cause him to act impulsively. It was this temper which would lead him to make a series of disastrous decisions in later years, which alienated his former allies and had immense consequences not only for himself, but for the entire Italian-American mafia. In the mid-1930s, the heat surrounding the murder of Boccia died down after a few weeks, and it became clear that the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the murder. What they did have, after a time, was enough evidence to send Luciano away for decades. In February 1936, in one of the largest police operations of its kind, 200 different brothels were raided across Manhattan and Brooklyn. The common link in many of them was that Charles Lucky Luciano was the man who allegedly ran them. With a dozen managers and over 100 prostitutes arrested and questioned, it was inevitable that some would talk, and a few weeks later Luciano was arrested and charged with pandering or pimping. In a rather short trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to a term of 30 to 50 years in prison, though many insiders stated in later years that Luciano was not heavily involved in prostitution and had been set up. What this meant was that Genovese now became the acting boss of the Luciano crime family, as Lucky was shipped off to the notorious Sing Sing prison and then Dannemora in upstate New York. He would have little ability to communicate with his associates, and from the summer of 1936 onwards, Genovese was the boss of one of the 5 families in all but name. It was not an easy time to become the acting boss. The New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who had led the investigation and conviction of Luciano, was determined to root out the mob's influence in New York, particularly its growing associations with the Tammany Hall political machine, which had controlled much of the city's politics since the middle of the 19th century. Genovese tried to avoid entanglement with Dewey's ongoing investigations by basing himself out of New Jersey and thus beyond Dewey's jurisdiction. Nevertheless, Dewey pressed ahead, and within months of taking over from Luciano, Vito was publicly named by him as a senior member of the mob, leading to pictures of him appearing widely in the New York newspapers. The first time he was thrust into the media spotlight to such an extent. Wary of the legal net closing in on him, as well as the ongoing investigations into the Boccia murder, and looking to avoid being locked up for decades like Luciano, Genovese decided to make himself scarce. In February 1937, he seems to have had his New Jersey mansion burned to the ground to claim on the insurance, and then he, Anna, and their 3 children from various marriages left for Italy with $750,000 in cash and $2 million in investments. Police reports claimed that Genovese was on vacation. However, he would not return for over 8 years. Though Anna soon returned to the US with her 2 children and stepchild, and regular cash payments of $100,000 were sent over to Vito over the next several years. In Italy, Genovese was stepping into what was a hornet's nest. The country had been taken over by Benito Mussolini and the National Fascist Party in 1922, and 3 years later, the man known as Il Duce, the leader, had declared war on the Italian mafia and other crime syndicates in southern Italy and Sicily. The initial crackdown was intense, and by the late 1920s, many crime incidences had reduced by 60% or more, all of which should have made it difficult for Genovese back in his homeland. Much of this, though, was optics. The fascist government had never wanted to completely crush the mafia, simply to bring it under control and get a slice of the cake. Genovese knew this well, and by spreading some money around in the late 1930s from Nola near Naples, where he took up residence, he soon acquired the goodwill of the regime, investing $25,000 in building a heliotherapy center for the regime, amongst other favors. More notable was Genovese's possible aid in having Carlo Tresca, an Italian émigré journalist living in New York who regularly critiqued Mussolini's government in print, gunned down in Manhattan in the early 1940s. All of this ensured that Genovese had a close relationship with Mussolini and his ministers, and a blind eye was turned to him running a complex black market operation in southern Italy from which he profited extensively. Much of this black market operation was built up from the autumn of 1939 onwards. War had come to Europe by then, and although Italy would not be directly involved in the Second World War until the summer of 1940, goods became more difficult to acquire from the start of the conflict as the clash between Germany and Britain and France interrupted trade and supply routes across the continent. In these circumstances, black market trading flourished, and it boomed from the summer of 1940 onwards after Italy joined the war on Germany's side, an action which created huge difficulties in Mediterranean supply lines as a major campaign was initiated by Italy against Britain and the Free French to secure North Africa. When Italy and Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the US in December 1941 and pulled them into the war, it greatly damaged Genovese's ability to communicate with his associates in New York. Seeing the writing on the wall, he and the mafia back in America now worked out an arrangement with the US government, whereby they would use their contacts across Sicily and southern Italy to facilitate the planned invasion of the country in the summer of 1943, to open up a southern front in Europe. As a man on the ground, Genovese was ideally situated to profit from this arrangement. Operation Husky, the joint invasion of Sicily by the US, Britain and the other Western Allies, commenced on the 9th of July 1943. In just over a month, Sicily was secured, and then the campaign moved into southern Italy, with Naples falling on the 1st of October. By that time, Mussolini had been overthrown, then rescued by the Germans, who launched a counterattack into Italy after setting him up as a puppet ruler in the north of the country. With Allied supply networks across the south developing in anticipation of a long fight to secure Rome, Genovese greased the right palms and was soon moving large amounts of army goods and supplies on the black markets around the south of the peninsula. He did this with most of the proper official documentation in place and was able to freely move literal convoys of trucks of canned foods, fruit and veg, sugar, flour, and a wide array of other goods sent to Italy for the army around the Allied occupied regions. At the same time, he was working as an interpreter and point of contact between the US Army and leading political and social figures in cities like Naples who would be needed to help reconstruct the region in the coming months. While all of this was occurring in Italy, matters had taken a negative turn for Genovese back in New York. Early in 1944, Ernest the Hawk Rupolo, one of the 5 gunmen who had been involved in the killing of Ferdinand Boccia back in 1934, had been arrested on a separate murder charge. Looking at a significant prison sentence, Rupolo told the prosecutors he had evidence which could help convict Genovese for the 1934 murder of Boccia. His evidence was corroborated by another state witness, Jerry Esposito. Consequently, with two individuals willing to testify to Genovese having ordered the hit of Boccia a decade earlier, there were now murder charges waiting for Genovese if he ever returned to New York. What was worse, in Italy he was also under investigation by a dogged agent of the Army Criminal Investigation Division by the name of Orange C. Dickey, who had been determined to bring charges of black market smuggling against Vito. It took months for Dickey to manage to accomplish this, as many higher-ups were disinclined to broadcast the uneasy alliance which existed between the US government and the Italian mafia, while the war was still underway. But eventually, in August 1944, Genovese was arrested by American military police. It was not until the war ended that Genovese was finally extradited back to the US, arriving there in June 1945 after 8 years in Italy. He was charged with the Boccia murder thereafter. However, the charge didn't stick, as Jerry Esposito was found shot dead in New Jersey months later, and without a witness to corroborate Rupolo's testimony, the case against Genovese collapsed. Not long after the case against him collapsed, Genovese, like so many others whom he had worked with since the 1920s, received word of a meeting which would take place in the Hotel Nacional in Havana, Cuba, over Christmas 1946. The meeting was organized by Mayor Lansky and Luciano, who had been released by the US government following the war in return for having provided aid to the government in managing the labor movement in America, and forming connections between the US military and the mafia in Italy in 1943. He had subsequently been deported to Italy after the war ended, and so Cuba was being used as a destination where the meeting could be held close to America while not entering it. The mafia also had extensive gambling interests and other concerns in Havana by that time. The meeting, which lasted for several days in Havana, was significant in the mob's expansion of their interests in Cuba, but it was notable for Genovese in other respects. During it, he put forward a scheme to Luciano. Frank Costello was now the acting head of the Luciano crime family in New York, and had been since Genovese fled to Italy back in 1937. In an effort to undercut him, Genovese proposed that Luciano should claim the long-dormant title of Boss of Bosses, and then appoint Vito as the acting boss in Lucky's absence from America. Luciano did not respond well. He angrily told Genovese that he had turned down the title back in 1931 when it was offered to him, and he had no intention of taking it now. Costello would remain acting head of the family, and he didn't want to hear about the idea ever again. Despite Luciano's best efforts to intimidate Genovese into backing down and avoiding a power struggle at the top of the family in New York, in years to come, the rivalry between Costello and Genovese for control of the Luciano crime family would re-emerge. In the immediate aftermath of both his return to America and the collapse of the Boccia case, Vito's primary concern was to build his interests back up while keeping a low profile at the same time. He rarely appeared in the newspaper for the remainder of the 1940s, only doing so when a journalist brought up the collapse of the Boccia case every now and then. Similarly, his business interests, to any outside observer, seemed pedestrian. These included running freight companies in New York and the Lower West Side Colonial Trading Company, which dealt in processing waste rags and paper. While these acted as a good cover, his business in the 1940s and into the early 1950s included a large role in gambling and the Italian lottery, as well as running bars and brothels. The NYPD were also anxious to tie him to the city's narcotics trade, yet this was difficult to do. In the post-war era, many mob bosses in New York and elsewhere were reticent about involving themselves too openly or heavily in the narcotics trade, wary of how easy it was to get arrested for this and how steep the prison sentences were. This wasn't to say that Genovese wasn't involved, but it wasn't his or Costello's bread and butter, the way that bootleg alcohol had been back in the 1920s. Genovese once again made front pages of New York newspapers in the early 1950s, owing to an unexpected source of controversy, his wife Anna. His years away in Italy had seen him and his wife Anna drift apart. She had begun operating a number of gay and lesbian clubs and bars in New York while he was in exile, and there were rumors of infidelity, specifically with other women. Now, in October 1950, the New York Daily News reported that Anna had petitioned the courts for a large amount of financial support from Vito, claiming he had deserted her in 1948 and wasn't providing sufficient income to her and their son, who was still a teenager. Worryingly, she was willing to disclose details of Vito's business interests to the court, noting that he had wide-ranging companies around New York and even a dog track down in Virginia, and often earned upwards of $30,000 a week. This was submitted as evidence to a judge behind closed doors in private, and in 1951 Anna agreed to try to live with Vito again. However, when this didn't work and the matter ended up before an open court in 1953, Genovese's associates were scandalized by Anna's revelations. Mob culture dictated that the wife of a boss kept matters in-house, yet Vito didn't try to silence her. Instead, he had Stephen France, an associate who he had charged with supervising Anna's affairs while he was absent in Italy, murdered by Joseph Falacchi in June 1953, seemingly as a means of offsetting wider unrest within the Luciano crime family resulting from the actions of his wife. The rivalry which had ebbed and flowed between Genovese and Costello for control of affairs since Genovese returned to the US from Italy in 1945 came to a head during the mid-1950s because of the same crime that brought Al Capone down a quarter of a century earlier in Chicago: tax evasion. Anna's alimony case had revealed details of how much money Genovese was making, and the Internal Revenue Service were also snooping around the finances of a good many other leading mafiosi in New York, Costello chief amongst them. Both Vito and Frank were neck-deep in problems of this sort for several years, eventually culminating in Costello being found guilty of tax evasion in May 1954. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, yet by appealing, he delayed starting his sentence for 2 years, until the summer of 1956. Costello's incarceration opened up a debate as to who would serve as acting boss in the interim. Genovese felt that he was the natural successor. Others were less sure. In any event, it was all scuppered within months, as Costello's sentence was reduced on a fresh appeal, and in March 1957, he was set free after serving less than a year in jail. Genovese had come close to obtaining the position of power within the Luciano crime family, which he had long coveted, when Costello went to jail. Now, in the late 1950s, he did not intend to simply return to the old situation. Hence, a few weeks after Costello was released from prison, Vito ordered Vincent Gigante, a former boxer turned mobster who was a protege of Genovese's and would one day become one of the leading figures in the New York Mafia, to kill Costello. The attempted assassination, which is one of the most famous events in the history of the Italian-American Mafia, took place on the 2nd of May 1957, as Gigante jumped from a car as Costello was entering his apartment building in Manhattan, shooting him in what he believed was a fatal wound to the head. The bullet, however, only grazed Costello's head. Gigante was later identified as a suspect by police, based on testimony by the doorman of the building. He was acquitted when Costello refused to give any meaningful testimony. Yet the incident was enough to convince Costello that Genovese didn't intend to stop until he had become the head of the Luciano crime family. Accordingly, shortly after the assassination attempt, he announced his intention to retire. Genovese succeeded him as acting head, and with Luciano permanently in exile in Italy, Vito had finally achieved his goal of becoming the head of one of the 5 families. Curiously, Gigante and Costello subsequently became firm friends, and the would-be assassin visited the home of the man he had very nearly killed several times in years to come. In the months that followed, Genovese moved to consolidate his position. While Lucky Luciano had turned down the title of Boss of Bosses back in 1931, the Luciano crime family had nevertheless emerged as the most powerful of the 5 families at the time. As his meeting with Luciano in Havana back in 1946 indicates, Genovese had always aspired to become acting head of the family and then effectively a new boss of bosses. Others were wary of his ambitions in this respect, particularly Albert Anastasia, another figure who had risen up as part of Joe the Boss Massaria's outfit back in the 1920s, alongside Genovese, Costello and Luciano. By 1957, Anastasia was the boss of the Gambino crime family. He had a reputation for erratic behavior and an overpropensity for murdering people, which had led him to be variously called the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner. Fearing that Anastasia would react to his ousting of Costello, Genovese ordered his death in October 1957. The 2 gunmen who were charged with the task were more thorough than Gigante had been with Costello, unloading a plethora of bullets into Anastasia in a barbershop on 7th Avenue on the 25th of October 1957. With this, for an all too fleeting period, Genovese became the most powerful mafia boss in New York City. With Anastasia dead, Genovese moved to consolidate his position and have it acknowledged by the other heads of not just the New York families, but the leaders of numerous other branches of Cosa Nostra throughout the United States. Accordingly, he organized a national meeting to be held at the home of Joseph the Barber Barbara in Apalachin, in upstate New York, on the 14th of November 1957, just 3 weeks after Anastasia was killed. The meeting was largely held for the purposes of Genovese being acknowledged as head of what was now being transformed from the Luciano crime family into the Genovese crime family. Genovese was aware that there were numerous capos of crews in the Gambino crime family and elsewhere that were not happy with the murder of Anastasia and were considering going to war with him. Beyond this, the meeting was also to be one of the largest gatherings of the heads of the Italian-American mob during the 20th century, and it was intended that a wide array of other business issues would be discussed, including the growing Marxist revolution in Cuba and the threat it posed to the mafia's interests there, while things as seemingly mundane as the mafia's control over the garment industry on the East Coast were also scheduled for debate. None of this would ever be achieved. Barbara's house in Apalachin had been under surveillance for some time prior to the meeting, and as dozens of expensive cars began arriving and parking in the area on the morning of the 14th of November, it became apparent that something out of the ordinary was occurring there. As the police investigated further and called in reinforcements, roadblocks were set up on the roads leading away from Barbara's house. When someone arriving to the house just after the meeting had started revealed this, the gathering quickly broke up without having resolved much of anything. In the hour or so that followed, over 60 of those who were attending the meeting were arrested as they tried to get away, Genovese and several other heads of the commission included. Prosecutions followed in which everyone claimed that they had simply heard Barbara was ill and had been visiting to wish him well. The state authorities weren't convinced and decided that they would charge dozens of those involved with orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. This is a notoriously difficult crime to prosecute, and although dozens of those who had been arrested were convicted, fined and given sentences of a few years each, every single one of the convictions was overturned on appeal. Ultimately, while there was no doubt that the Apalachin meeting was a major gathering of the heads of the Italian-American mafia, there was nothing explicitly illegal in what they were doing by assembling together in the house of a friend. Genovese didn't have long to enjoy, having finally achieved his rise to become one of the heads of the 5 families. In the early summer, he was summoned to appear on the 2nd of July before a U.S. Senate hearing to testify on matters relating to illegal conduct and management practices within the labor movement and Teamsters unions in America. These have become known as the McClellan hearings, as they were chaired by Senator John L. McClellan, a Democratic senator from Arkansas, although they are more usually noted in association with Robert F. Kennedy, brother of the soon-to-be president, who acted as the chief counsel for the Senate during the hearings and carried out much of the examination of those called before it. Genovese was summoned owing to his verifiable role in the garment industry, which in turn was heavily unionized. McClellan described Genovese as the most important witness to be summoned before the hearings. However, when he showed up, Genovese stoically sat there and invoked the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination to over 150 questions, including when he was asked to provide his date of birth. It was a masterclass in refusing to cooperate with law enforcement on any level. More worrying matters were still waiting for Genovese within days of his appearance at the McClellan hearings. On the 7th of July 1958, just 8 months after the Appalachian meeting and 3 days after his appearance before the Senate, he was arrested for drug trafficking. The case stemmed from an alleged drug deal involving a Puerto Rican drug dealer by the name of Nelson Cantelops, who had agreed to become a state witness in New York. After a 13-week trial, in the first months of 1959, Genovese was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He would appeal, but eventually on the 11th of February 1960, he had to give himself up to be incarcerated. It was the last time he would be a free man, as he was bussed off to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Georgia, where he would spend the next several years. Strangely, when he arrived there, a series of tests revealed that Genovese had an IQ of just 84. A subsequent test revealed it to be 95, yet still fairly low for an alleged criminal mastermind. More broadly, his arrest and sentencing in the late 1950s was a peculiar event. Genovese always believed that he had been framed, and many commentators since have agreed that it would have been entirely out of the ordinary for the head of a crime family or any senior mafia capo to be involved directly in negotiating a drug deal of the kind for which he was convicted. Some have speculated that Luciano, who had become opposed to the man he had come up with in the 1920s, had pulled strings from Italy to set Genovese up, unhappy at the idea that he was turning the Luciano crime family into the Genovese crime family. Genovese spent the last 9 years of his life in prison. He attempted to continue running affairs from jail, where he was incarcerated with Vincent Gigante, the protege who he had ordered to kill Costello a few years earlier and who had been implicated with Genovese in the drug charge in 1958. Indeed, he was imprisoned in Atlanta with numerous other associates, including Joseph Valacchi, the mobster Genovese had hired to kill Stephen Franz, the man who had been monitoring his wife Anna's actions while he was in Italy. Valacchi was a man who was mistrusted for numerous reasons by Genovese and several others. While in Atlanta, he became increasingly paranoid that he was going to be killed, and when he was indicted on a further charge in 1962, he decided to turn state's witness. What followed in 1963, in appearances before the McClellan hearings, which were still running 5 years after Genovese had been summoned before the same committee, was some of the most explosive evidence ever provided about the Italian-American mafia. Testimony in which Valacchi provided information on the existence of Cosa Nostra and how it had developed going all the way back to the 1920s. Valacchi having fought with Salvatore Maranzano in the Castellamarese War back in the early 1930s and being a first-hand witness to events stretching all the way back to Prohibition. Valacchi claimed that Genovese was effectively the boss of bosses and was running 3 branches of Cosa Nostra from Atlanta. However, little did he know that this was no longer the case. Vito had been transferred from Atlanta to a penitentiary in Leavenworth in Kansas by then, authorities being unhappy with the fact that he was running his own fiefdom within the prison in Atlanta. Here he was effectively cut off from running affairs, and after he obtained early parole for his own sentence, Vincent Gigante and numerous others would gradually begin running the Genovese crime family in New York in an unofficial capacity from the mid-1960s onwards. In Kansas, Genovese was an increasingly decrepit figure, suffering from a combination of emphysema, heart problems, and bladder cancer. A heavy smoker all his life, prison reports from 1967 stated that he was old beyond his 70 years. By January 1969, he could barely walk without becoming short of breath. He was moved to a medical center for prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. However, little could be done to treat his conditions, and after suffering a further pulmonary embolism, he died in the very early hours of the 14th of February 1969. Police and journalists had expected a lavish funeral for the man who had aspired and to some extent become the boss of bosses. Yet when it was held 3 days after he died, just over 100 people attended, a figure which would have been substantially lower had dozens of pupils from the school where Vito's daughter Nancy was a teacher not been in attendance. No eulogies were given, and he was buried afterwards in Queens in a family plot. Though neither he nor anyone else in the Italian mafia could have been aware of it at the time, in retrospect, the period around when Vito Genovese died in the late 1960s was the beginning of the end of the golden age of Cosa Nostra, our thing in the United States. There was a growing commitment around this time within political circles and law enforcement, especially following Valachi's testimony before the Senate in 1963 to crack down on organized crime out of concerns that with its control of the unions, the construction industry and many utilities, as well as its grip on Las Vegas and the illegal drug trade in dozens of cities, it had become far too powerful. Beginning in the 1970s, huge amounts of resources were pumped into combating the mob in cities like New York, Chicago, Kansas City and Las Vegas. These bore fruit in the 1980s, and that decade saw the mafia's stranglehold on Las Vegas's gambling and hospitality sectors come to an end. While the imposition of ever greater sentences for drug trafficking and distribution led to more and more former mafia associates turning state's evidence to avoid large prison sentences. Even John Gotti, the famed head of the Gambino crime family in New York, who earned the sobriquet the Teflon Don in the 1980s for his ability to be acquitted time after time when arrested and sent for trial, was eventually convicted on murder charges and sentenced to life in prison in 1992. The mafia is alive and well in the United States today, but its power and influence is minuscule compared to what it used to be. Vito Genovese in many ways was responsible for some of the decline of the mafia in the 1970s and 1980s. He rose up in the 1920s as part of a group of Italian-born criminals who had moved in their childhood years to New York City. This second generation of mafiosi in the Big Apple included some of the most significant figures in the history of the Italian mafia in America. Individuals like Genovese, Luciano, Costello and some of their associates in the Jewish American crime world like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. Forged by Prohibition, they led the mafia from a period in which it was a complex but disorganized crime syndicate to become the Commission of the 1930s, which ultimately led to the mob becoming a nationwide organization which controlled much of the American underworld. Genovese, though, over time became a dangerous figure. Unlike Luciano and Costello, who were more cool-headed and understood that a decentralized system in which as little attention as possible was courted was best for all parties. After he returned to America following the Second World War, Genovese was increasingly willing to undermine the mafia's wider operations in pursuit of his ambition to become the boss of bosses, much like Salvatore Maranzano had briefly been back in 1931. Ultimately, his efforts to do so in the 1950s were his own undoing and contributed to the process whereby the US government began to attack the mafia in a much more concerted fashion. What do you think of Vito Genovese? Did he ultimately initiate the decline of the Italian mafia through his overly aggressive and inflammatory actions to achieve power? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.